Hello, this is Mike Gulworth. Welcome to the webinar, everybody, today. We're here with Rob Cross, who's a professor at Babson University. I have known Rob for a long time, I think now over 10 years, maybe actually closer to 15 years. And I would have to say he's one of my favorite academics, or as somebody told me recently, he's a pracademic. So it's not just theory, not just frameworks, but how do you actually take the insights that he's identified through his research and actually apply them, use them within organizations. So as you might have seen with Rob's bio, he was at the University of Virginia for a number of years, wrote a book there called The Hidden Power of Social Networks, has written just hundreds probably of articles in various journals, a lot of articles in the Harvard Business Review. And most recently, he has done some work that I find fascinating on what he calls collaborative overload. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And this sort of work and the outcomes of some of this work that Rob's been doing is an outcome of a relationship that Executive Networks has with an organization called IRC for HR, and you'll see some contact information for them a little bit later. But they've been sponsoring some of Rob's work and really the bringing of the frameworks, the concepts, the ideas into a practical format that people like the people that are on this webinar today can access freely and use within their own organizations. So with that all being said, as a lead in, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob, welcome. Nice to have you here today.
All right, thank you. And thank you for everybody on the call for being here and making the time to participate in a couple of different opportunities. I'd echo Mike's comment and the appreciation we have for IRC4HR in terms of sponsoring some of the work here that enabled us to document what was a part of a larger interview-based study and get it organized around a couple of different themes. But the broader focal point of the work that we've been doing has, I went out and identified 20 great organizations and asked them to provide me access for their top performing women and for their top performing men. I actually asked them to identify who they consider the most successful women for the most successful men as leaders, and then went out and conducted very deep 90 to 120-minute interviews with these individuals to see, in essence, at key inflection points in their lives and their careers, what was the role of networks and collaboration in being able to outperform. And in specific, we learned a lot about how people innovate, execute, and thrive through networks and ways of managing those relationships over time. And I keep using the word successful because what I was interested in is who are the people that are in the top performance category. So they're doing well performance-wise, but that they also were scoring higher on measures of thriving or resilience or engagement or career satisfaction. Basically what I'm looking for is, are you doing well and are you sustainable, over time? And so what we're starting with today as a series here is really focused on what do people do through connections that enable them to thrive in their work, to enable them to kind of show up fully present, be fully there. And we find that a huge component that enables people to thrive and to get a sense of purpose and meaning from their work actually isn't the nature of the work itself. I mean, obviously that plays a role, and I'm exaggerating just a little bit, but of all the organizations that we had in this study, some of them did truly noble things. They cured cancer, they fed the hungry, they built infrastructure for the poor. And then I had one that I won't mention that did one of the most mundane things you could imagine. And yet, of all the places we were in, the place that had the greatest sense of thriving and engagement, that people showed up and they were absolutely sure they were solving the world's problems, even though it was a pretty mundane product, turned out to be the one that had the least meaningful purpose in the work, right? And then I could look to these other places that had truly noble pursuits and they would engage and interact with each other in ways that actually destroyed a sense of purpose or meaning. So the first component that you have access to as a product of what IRC4HR has enabled are 4 different lesson plans that we see. If we look across these 160 interviews that we did and really dissect down, what are leaders doing that are thriving in their work, that are showing up fully present, and what's the role and ways that they manage connections around them that enable them to do that. And you find that it's very tactical things. And one of the great joys of being able to work with a place like IRC4HR is that we're able to go out and do some write-ups that actually get down to the tactics and the specifics of what these people are doing, the things they've learned over 20 years that have a major effect on the degree to which they're thriving in their work. And it's very different a lot of times than what you get pushed to write if you're writing for, one of the major publication outlets, that all they want are the kind of counterintuitive tendencies, the big aha moment, and not so much the day-to-day tactics. So I would urge people to take a look at the paper that's attached to the webinar. It includes all 4 of these lesson plans. Today, what we'll focus on is more on this idea of collaborative overload. Just take one of the 4, and the core notion for me is that the people that do better, in essence, are proactive or playing offense on managing collaborative demands, collaborative overload that they experience each day. Now, I know we have a lot of new people on the call here, and so I want to orient a little bit to the network ideas and then dive down into very specifically what we've been focused on from a collaborative overload standpoint. But as you can imagine, most of us are conditioned to think about how work is happening in organizations by looking at the formal chart. And this is an example drawn from my first book years and years ago, where a major petrochemical organization was losing a tremendous amount of money in their deep sea drilling area, in essence because they weren't moving best practices well across platforms. And they had thrown databases and technologies and other things at the problem, but weren't getting any major performance improvements as a product of that, and said, can we look at the network? Can we see who's turning to whom for information to get work done? So the real group in this case was many, many thousands, distributed globally, and I'm obviously not starting with that as an example, but what I am showing you is a very high-level representation of what we typically see when we look at these networks and patterns of who's collaborating with whom in organizations. Done this over 20 years, worked with over 300 top organizations, done the analytics over 1,000 times in groups ranging from a couple hundred to 40, 50,000. And what we can always expect to see is, typically about 3 to 5% of the people account for about 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations. And usually companies are unaware of about 50% of these people. And they're oftentimes falling into positions of very significant overload in different ways. They get good, they get a reputation, poor role design is driving excessive demands back to them. There's different drivers of it, but what we've learned is that people that fall into this spot, they have a greater tendency these days to leave the organization. It used to be that not getting connected enough was the biggest driver of departure, and now it's very bimodal. It's people that get overwhelmed with the volume and the diversity of demands that come at them, and they're choosing to leave or they disengage in different ways. We can also start to get a sense of where are the capabilities on the fringe of the network that maybe we're not getting as great a utilization from that we wish. So for example, we very commonly see it take newcomers, people entering the organization up to 5 years to replicate the connectivity of the high performers in strongly relational oriented cultures. So a lot of what places are interested in is how do we identify what's happening with Mitchells of the world. And obviously there's never just one. If we're looking at groups of 1,000 or 2,000, can literally be hundreds of these people distributed throughout the group that are under-recognized, overwhelmed, slowing work down, more likely to leave. And the key question is, how do you take and balance some of these collaborative demands out? How do you identify portions of role that you can shift? How do you understand what capabilities the central people are being sought for that you can shift to others? And if you take this lens, you can have a pretty marked effect in balancing out connectivity in the group, and also in finding where you might use different patterns of collaboration to bridge silos that are having impact. So in this case, the production division had just moved up 2 floors in the building, and they'd lost all the hallway interaction they'd been using to coordinate, and it was causing major impediments to the ability to get work done. Very easy once you understand that Mitchell was a bottleneck in this spot, and he was a bottleneck mainly because he owned access to a certain database that everybody had to come to him for. It made sense 10 years ago, but as they'd grown, they suddenly had this pinch point that was slowing things down and overwhelming Mitchell, not by virtue of his fault, but by virtue of poor role design, becomes very easy to think about how to shift that, create alternative go-to people, create alternative ways to get to the information. And so it matters for performance, but what we're also seeing is it really matters for engagement and well-being of individuals today. So this is a plot that we published in the first Harvard Business Review article on this, where we're showing on the horizontal axis, the vertical axis is the number of times each person in this group is sought out for information. On the horizontal axis, it's the number of times people are saying, if I don't get more access to this individual, I can't hit my business goals, right? And so you get the idea, the dots are people in here, and as you migrate from the bottom to the top, you're starting to see people that are more and more both in demand, they're helping a lot of others, and others are saying, if I don't get more of this person's time, I can't do my work, right? And what you see is the bubble sizes here reflect people's relative satisfaction scores, right? With bigger being better. We always used to see the bottom left-hand quadrant, right? That people are happy until they figure out how bad it is to be in a given spot. What's new for us in many ways is seeing that people hit these threshold levels of overload, and it's driven by both the volume and the diversity of demands that are coming at us. And then they start to burn out and disengage. And one of two bad things happens in that situation if your organization or you are not paying attention to it. One is that the people leave. And again, that's increasingly happening. And so you end up losing great talent that was enabling others to get things done. Or two is that they start to burn out. And we find that especially when leaders fall into this position of overload, it's not just that they burn out, but then they tend to drive attrition around them at phenomenal rates. Study we just finished showed that leaders that passed certain thresholds of overload had greater than 200% greater attrition rates around them compared to the leaders that were managing overload in a specific way, in a specific fashion. So what we've been interested in is what do more efficient collaborators do, and how can we learn and adapt some of the practices that they're engaged in to teach others to how to kind of handle this onslaught, if you will. Generally speaking, if we look at all the work we're doing around networks and collaboration, we see about 80 to 95% of people's time today is spent on email and phone calls or in meetings, virtual or face-to-face, and that this set of demands, these collaborative activities, have increased by about 50% or more, even for more transactional work over the past 8 or 9 years. And this isn't going away, right? It's due to globalization, matrix-based designs, interdependence of work, and complexity driving interactions higher and higher. Obviously, technology like email and social media use, you name it. It's a trend that's here to stay, yet there's nobody paying attention to it. There's no chief collaborative overload officer. There's nobody systematically seeing what's the efficiency of these interactions and how do we help manage where points of overload are occurring. It really falls to the individuals, right, to be proactive and actually take and make decisions that have an impact. And so what we did is think about what are the things that are driving these forms of overload, and you look down this list and you would immediately get the idea that it's a number of different kinds of patterns that are driving overload. It's not something that's going to be solved by just adapting a single technology or one single device for managing meetings more effectively. Rather, it's driven by a whole suite of forces. And what we were interested in this work, I was interested in, is seeing what do the people do that enable, in essence, greater return in networks. They give greater impact, and they take less time from their colleagues. And we went out and plotted those networks out. And just like I showed you a scatter plot a second ago, what I could do is actually go out and find the efficient collaborators. Again, the people that gave the greatest impact took the least time, and ended up interviewing them. And ultimately, through the course of this work, I've interviewed over 100 women, 100 men, and really been honing in on what are the things those people do on the margin that enable them to buy back 18 to 24% of their time compared to average, not even compared to the time sinks that most of us can think about. The people that you see coming and there goes an hour of your life you'll never get back. What I'm saying is that the people that just do 3 or 4 things differently, they buy back about 18 to 24% against the average, right? And of course, what that enables them to do, number one, is to thrive more in their work, but number two, to also invest in connections that have a bigger impact on their ability to innovate and execute. over time. So I want to walk through 3 ideas that we see as having the biggest impact on what these people are doing across all the interviews, and then through a diagnostic and some analytics that we pulled together over the past several years quantitatively as well. But the first is that they are putting structure into their work. And so you're much more likely to see, for example, the more efficient collaborators strategically calendar on Friday night or Sunday night, either 1 week out or 4 weeks out. They're plotting out in blocks activities that are going to pull them to their North Star objectives, right? And so they're imposing structure and not just being reactive to the onslaught of email. They're much more likely to block time, and they'll do it in different ways. Some people will want to block time in the morning for creative work. Other people want to get emails done immediately. People will pick the middle of the day. Everybody has different rhythms of work. It's not so much the specific tactic as it is the practice of blocking time to do some kind of reflective work through the course of a given day or a given week. So they do a number of things in terms of orienting towards North Star objectives. They do a number of things to manage role interdependencies and not just take the role as given, but actually be proactive in morphing it and making sure that they're being pulled into interactions where they have unique value to add. So to give you a sense of this, and specifically what we see, I want to tell you 2 different stories. One that's a focus around volume of collaborative demands becoming a problem, and then a second one that's focused more on the diversity. First one, this is a very well-known organization. I can't mention the name of it or I'll get in trouble, and I'm going to tell you a story about somebody named Scott that's obviously a pseudonym as well. But Scott was an individual, came into this organization, and for 4 or 5 years hadn't done anything, wildly substantive. He was a good employee, but nothing wildly substantive. And then was put on a new product development initiative that became this organization's blockbuster product. So if I mention the name of it, you'd go, got it, right? I know exactly what you're talking about. And because of that initial success, and then derivative products that came off of that initial success, he flew up the hierarchy. Until at this point, when I came in contact with him, he was managing this group of 1,800 people and 2 others of similar size. And he was talked about by many, many people there as the likely heir apparent for the CEO, who's kind of the fair-haired child, if you will, and considered likely to be the next promotion up. And so it was amazing to me because I was there looking at their top 10,000, and we were focused on how do we reduce decision cycles and time to market by virtue of seeing ineffective decision processes and practices, and walking down the hallway with the CEO to go into the boardroom and talk about some of the things they could do. And he pulled me aside and he said, I'd like you to look specifically at Scott. And because he was saying we're about to fire him. Right? They weren't going to fire him. He said they were going to put him in a penalty box assignment of some sort. But, he said, it's amazing to us because it's somebody that has flown up the hierarchy, been amazing at every level. People loved him. And yet he's hit this position and his engagement scores are suffering in his units. His peers are grumbling about him not coming through on commitments. He's missing market opportunities that he should be getting. And he said it's bewildering to us. Now, of course, they didn't have that big hairball of a network behind Scott, right? They were just looking at Scott going, why is he faltering? When we put the network on and made it visible, what you find is in this group, he had 118 people coming to him frequently for information, and another 78 that said, if I don't get more of his time, I can't hit my business goals. And this was 1 out of 3 groups, right? So when I met him, I didn't know him at all, but you could tell physically he was wrung out, right? He had somebody that actually was not hoarding information. He came in and he was doing everything a lot of the books tell us to do today, right? Take layers out of the hierarchy under the myth that that's going to create more nimble organizations, when in fact, a lot of times it creates different kinds of inefficiencies. As a servant-based mindset, open door policy, and all of these things that created access to him that on the surface sounds great, but it had created an implosion in the network around him, and he couldn't quite figure out how to get out of it, right? So here's what he did, and very specifically, he sat down with his coach, and this is something everybody can do, and it has a big effect every time it's done. He looked back over his calendar and email system for 4 months and was pulling out select threads to see what are the routine things that I'm continuing to get pulled into that I don't add unique value to anymore, right? Because people used to come to me for expertise on something, or they're conditioned for me to show up to a certain meeting, but the nature of my role has changed and I don't add unique value. And he was very geared around identifying routine decisions that are consuming too much of his time, routine informational requests that were coming back to him that he could create alternative go-to people on, and if there were portions of his role that he could shift, recurring meeting interactions, things like that. And the focal point then, as I was showing you earlier, was to say, how do we identify these sets of recurring activities that are just stuck to the individual, bucket them, and then give them to people that are mid-tier in the network or talent that you're trying to draw in as a magical effect of delayering the overwhelmed and drawing in talent in ways that you want. And by virtue of doing that, because we had the network analytics, we could see he bought back about 18% of his time just by shifting things, not that he needed to hold on to, but things that were kind of the death of 1,000 cuts. And that's really the nature of this game. It's not big things that kill us. It's the slow creep of the hundreds and hundreds of smaller things that we keep trying to fight through. Then he stepped back and said, okay, behaviorally, what am I doing, right, that's causing this problem? The first piece was, how do I adapt my role? And when I say managing role interdependencies, that always boils down to information, decisions, portions of role, and then are you teaching people to consume you well? Or are you falling into patterns where they're dictating your life more than they should be? Second step is, what are you doing behaviorally? He found himself that he needed to begin to ask more questions and answer fewer. He had a real paternalistic view of leadership, and he loved to help. He felt like when he helped, that was when he was doing his job. And that all sounds great, but if you get identity from that to too great a degree, then you become the path of least resistance for anybody that has a problem. And it starts to create implosion. And he realized he had to reframe how he viewed himself providing value and connect people around him. He was more selective on problems that he jumped into to help others solve, rather than continuing to jump into emails or threaded discussions. He was more cautious of when and how he inserted himself in different ways. And the way he learned that was actually the company imposed a moratorium on him and made him unplug for 7 days. And he said it was, hear him describe it, it was like a heroin withdrawal. To not be on email and constantly on for the first day or two. And we know, neuroscience wise that's not too far off, right? The jolt we get from constantly being online. But he got through the 7 days, and then he immediately went back on email, right? And at his level, he was looking at thousands of them a day, but he was going to try to get caught up. And what he learned from that is he would see an issue evolve 7 days ago, viscerally feel his blood pressure rising and that he needed to jump in, and then find out that it had been solved fine without him, 2, 3, 4 emails later. And it was really he that was causing the problem a lot of times in terms of when he inserted himself, because he would insert with only partial awareness of what needed to be done. And then suddenly he had churn in the network as people were managing the issue and him at the same time. So you get the idea. For him, it was an eye-opener to just step back and think about how and where to jump in. And this is the biggest driver we see of overload. I came into this thinking it was all going to be emails, nasty bosses, time zones, and meetings. And I came out completely convinced that 50% of it is a tax we put on ourselves by jumping in when we shouldn't, because of certain different drivers. For some people, it's liking to help. For some people, it's liking status. For other people, it's fear of missing out or fear of not, being labeled a poor colleague. But it has a big effect. And becoming aware of that matters to a great degree. So for Scott, he managed to move from number 1 overloaded person to number 17 in the first year and 23 in the second. The idea wasn't to get him out of everything, but to impose structure that shifted demands away from him in a way that enabled him to be successful, and then behaviorally to think about what changes do I need to make to keep from overwhelming in different ways. I'll tell you a slightly more condensed story here, but a different scenario where it wasn't so much the volume of the demands, but the diversity of them that was causing overload. So this is a lady that mid-career, so not top of the house yet, but very strong trajectory up mid-career, and really juggling 3 broad categories of things around family in terms of a demanding child, ailing parent, spouse unhappy in current job. Job itself had a significant number of stressors created around collaborative demands due to the explosion of a set of global projects and implementation of a new matrix structure. And then amidst all of this, engaging in a part-time master's program as a way to continue to advance from a career standpoint. This individual, the challenge was volume, certainly, but the real challenge was around the switching costs that was created by the diversity of the demands coming at it constantly. And I think probably never in history have we been in a context when so many different kinds of demands can come at us, and they all impose very real switching costs. Even the act of looking down at a text and back up, the cognitive scientists are showing can incur as much as a 64-second recovery. And the idea of moving across meetings or across broader domains takes us a lot longer than we realize to be able to come back up to speed. So for her, it's a different set of solutions. It was blocking time on calendar, turning off email and devices. She picked the middle of the day where she focused on ensuring reflective time, getting alignment at work and home to avoid costs of competing priorities, increasingly aware of a need to control situations for her from an identity standpoint. And she focused a lot on Marshall Goldsmith's 25% rule. If you can't have greater than 25% impact, a lot of times it's not worth making comments on employees' PowerPoint decks or suggestions or plans, because you drive overload back to yourself in ways that becomes untenable over time. Plus you rob engagement from others around them. So you get the idea, and that there were different paths that people were taking and resulted in different opportunities for them to think about what's the right way for me to be managing overload, in the sense of how I'm putting structure into the work, how I'm managing my own identity drivers, and then also tactically, am I doing certain things around meetings, emails, other things that buy back 18 to 24% of the time. And what you all had was the opportunity to take the assessment that went out with this invitation. And if you gave me 5 to 8 minutes to reclaim 18 to 24% of your collaborative time, that's my little plug, you get back an assessment. You go through 25 items that we know distinguish the more efficient collaborators, and you would get back an assessment that looks just like this, right? And so we know the more efficient collaborators build structure into their work differently. They challenge beliefs and the narratives they tell themselves about when they jump in, and they do things tactically. They manage email differently. It's not email that kills you, it's actually the culture of use that's the bigger problem, and they're aware of that, and they're using it differently. Bullets, they don't send it at 10 o'clock at night and freak people out. They'll send emails on a delay. They do a whole number of tactical things that create a different kind of culture of use. They run meetings differently. They do things like that. But if you've taken it, what you can get is the ability to see how do you stack up in different ways on these overload points. And this is just the imposed structure one, where I'll show just the self-rating of this individual. It's obviously dummy data, so it doesn't show the peaks and valleys most of you would see. And you can compare yourself against others if you want. So for example, if I wanted to see how do I stack up against top 25% happy people that have taken this, and we've had a huge number of people come into this since we released it, you can compare it in the database. Or if you've invited raters in to see and give you feedback, you can start to get a sense of how and where do people see ways that I'm working in different paths than I do. And what you see here is that it gives you very specific recommendations. So your opportunity, if you include raters in, is the area that you feel you do least substantively, and you feel, and your raters say the same thing. And if you pick, for example, proactive networking, and that's what popped out from the profile, it'll give you content around why this matters, what you can do about it. If you opt in for the raters, then you can also get a blind spot, right? Areas where you think you're not doing as well as others. You think you're doing better than others think you're doing. So I would use this as just a vehicle to think a little bit about, in each of these 3 categories, imposing structure, challenging beliefs, and altering behaviors, what 1 or 2 things do you want to do that could have greater impact for you moving forward and could help you buy back 18 to 24% of your time. What we see in all of this work is that the more efficient collaborators aren't doing just one thing. Again, there is no technical solution that solves this problem in its aggregate, because it's driven by how we structure our work, our identity, and then tactically, the things that a technology may solve are only a small piece of it at the end of the day. Rather, it's people that are tending to pick at least 1 and sometimes 2 from each of these categories and proactively, playing offense in essence to push demands back that buy back 18 to 24% of their time. So first piece is, are you doing things that put structure in? Do you have a clear North Star? Are you strategically calendaring? Are you blocking time? Are you managing role interdependencies? Are you doing a set of things that's not geared towards the David Allen time efficiency ideas, but it's focused on, are you doing things that buffer you from the incessant demands and keep you focused in ways that are going to help you distinguish your career along a trajectory you want, on expertise that you care about and values you want to live? The second piece for me then is thinking about the beliefs and identity-based triggers that tend to have people jump in and engage when they shouldn't in different ways. And again, if anything caught me off guard, it was really these sets of items that pervasively came out over and over again, and surprised me about the importance of them. As we have looked at the diagnostic, the online diagnostic, we've had 60,000 people take this thing since we released it. And we find that it's these pieces that are the hardest of the three components: structure, beliefs, and behaviors. These are the things that tend to cause people the greatest impact in different ways. And the way I uncovered it was I absolutely went into all these interviews convinced that the enemy was out there, right? It was demanding clients, overwhelmed bosses, unresponsive colleagues, meeting overload, time zones, etc. And I came out the other end completely convinced that 50% of it was us, right? That the enemy was a little bit more familiar than we realized. And the way that I would do that is I would get in conversations. You put yourself in this position with me. We're on the phone call. I'm talking about how do you manage overload. And almost universally, man or woman, industry, didn't matter, about the 45-minute mark, somebody would come up, you'd come back to me, and with a lot of conviction in your voice and intensity, you'd say, Rob, I hit a point in my life where I was just fed up. I realized I had to take control of my life back, and I wasn't healthy, or I wasn't seeing my children or my significant other, or whatever it may be. There were triggers that just got you to realize that you had to take your life back. And for about the first 100 interviews, I kept going off a cliff. I kept being really excited to hear the next sentence that was uttered, thinking it was going to be something magnificent, right? Like I went to Nepal, or I hiked the Appalachian Trail, or whatever, right? I sailed across the Atlantic, but something truly magnificent that these people did to reclaim their lives. And every single time I was woefully disappointed. People would set this idea up that they had to do something major and that they worried about it for weeks, and how are they going to tell their boss? And then every single time, this big, massive thing they were going to go do was actually really mundane. It was, I'm going to go home one day a week on time, or I'm not going to answer emails from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. so I can be fully present, with the children. But people would worry about this, for weeks, and think about and talk about it with others. How do I do this? How do I implement this big egregious thing? And then they would go do it, and 9 times out of 10, nobody noticed, right? And so, they would laugh about it. But what was obvious to me in all of that is that's a form of overload that's not driven by meetings, overwhelmed bosses, unresponsive colleagues, and time zones, right? That's a belief, a perception of how we feel like we need to show up that's causing the problem. And so what you're looking for in here is that kind of knee-jerk reaction. Everybody has probably had the experience, if you reflect on it, of getting asked to do something where you have some degree of discretion and knowing with every fiber of your being you shouldn't do it. Deep in your gut, you shouldn't do it. And yet we go do it anyway. And 6 weeks in, we're wondering, how am I back in the cycle of traveling when I don't want to be traveling, or, doing other things? That's what I'm looking for when you take the identity component of this survey. It's that one trigger that has a tendency to lead you to jump when you shouldn't. So, for example, for one lady that was in the study with me, she had a great desire to help. And it's one of the taxes that women take on in this, is there's a little bit more of a selfless orientation. The research shows over and over again, and that pays back in greater collaborative demands and greater intensity of collaborative demands. And so for her, she became aware of this 15 years in, and realized that if she didn't develop a heuristic for herself, that she was going to keep jumping when she shouldn't. And so for her, just a simple idea of saying yes means saying no. And whether that no meant to other career opportunities, or no meant to, being at a soccer game, whatever it may be, that simple heuristic of saying yes means saying no kept her present and kept her thinking about what she jumped into at different points. People do all sorts of different things like that, but what you're trying to identify is what's that identity driver How do you become more aware of it? And the problem is that overload tends to happen in two different ways, one of which is pretty predictable, right? People get promoted, they're asked to do something, or somebody sells them on this is going to be a great idea and a lot of fun, or we're scared to say no, right? These things come at us because we're scared to say no way too often because we see the word no as binary. We don't see it as an alternative, proposing alternatives to people. We think we have to say yes or no, and it locks us into a negative fear-based situation. These are the easier things to see, right? You see them coming, they're big surges of work. The promotion side of it, we see clearly that if people don't learn different ways of becoming more efficient collaboratively, they don't make it through, first line leader to manager, 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 manager to senior executive. The more insidious ones, though, are what I'll call the slow burn. And these were the things that when I would hear about divorces, I would hear about people that didn't have good relationships with their kids, or I would hear about people whose career just faltered. It was more tied to this, where you just incrementally take on more and more and more, and you work deeper into the weekend because you get satisfaction from accomplishment, because you get identity from helping, because we like status in a situation, because we're scared in different ways. And the problem is overload is not a concern right up until it is, right? You can continue to push a little harder, a little deeper, keep thinking it's going to get better in 6 weeks, right up until your significant other says no more, right? Or you lose a key employee, or some trigger, pushes over the edge, and that's when it becomes a massive problem. So as you look through that component of the assessment, or as you're reading the lesson plan around reducing collaborative overload, that's what you're looking for, right? Not thinking about these are froofy drivers that don't happen to me. I see them happening to other people, but not me. But rather, what's that one trigger, that one thing that I tend to jump into when I shouldn't? And then the final piece is really focused around behaviors, very specific things that people do that enable them to buy back about 18 to 24% of your time, of their time in interactions. And so let me cover this piece, and then we'll open it up for the last 10, 15 minutes for questions. So I want to remind people to keep inserting questions into the chat or features like that so we can process that with you all. But what we would see here is the people that were more efficient collaborators, they tended to do things that managed the channels of communication more efficiently. So they used email differently. Like I mentioned, they tended to write more streamlined emails, pose in the subject line what they're looking for, use bullet points, send it only at certain points in time, all sorts of things that really had nothing to do with email itself, but the culture of use around it. Or they managed meetings in a very different way, right? And they would impose structure in the meeting, set norms of people coming on time, it not being the group's responsibility to catch that person up. But then they would also put structure before the meeting and after the meeting. So before the meeting, agendas would be clearly set out, making it clear what's going to be decided so people knew if they had to come or not. A whole suite of things that actually enabled people to make more informed decisions. And then after the meeting, they would post notes and other things that, again, enabled people not to have to be in the room if they didn't add specific value. So what they're doing is not so much using or not using a given channel, but using it efficiently and for the right purposes. And then second, they're much more likely to create efficient norms of interaction with other people. So as one example of that, one of the things we see over and over and over again is the people that are more effective, they're not pushing their ideas out. They tend to be much greater and not much more effective at creating pull for their ideas. Right? And so rather than go out and develop something in all its glory and try to convince others that you have a great course of action, they're much more likely to get something partially developed, take it out and co-create with key stakeholders, diffuse ownership, generate energy around the idea. And so they invest a little bit more up front, but then they get those people's thoughts into the notion and they get them energized and enthused about the possibility. And so they have much greater efficiency downstream and much greater efficiency of interaction norms versus people, the other side of that either try to convince on logic or if you're using mandate or fear, right, too much, then that's something that becomes super inefficient because people constantly come back and check in different ways, in ways that put you in a position of overwhelm. So just to give you a set of some of the tactical items, I didn't do this in each section, because I didn't want to, draw it down too much into the details here. But often what we'll do is use polling in different places and have people identify what's the single most important thing you could do in each of these three categories to have effect. So the single most important thing of the 9 items in imposed structure, of the 8 items in challenge beliefs, and the 8 items in alter behaviors. And what you see, the most amazing thing in all of this is what I've been saying over and over again is reinforced. You'll see with the audience that the distribution of the selections are very balanced. There's no one thing that people say I need to go do. You generally find that meetings are a little bit more important than other things. That tends to be statistically the biggest driver of overload based on all the work. But you don't see that it's just 2 or 3 things to the exclusion of everything else, but rather that each person has a unique profile of things they need to go do, right? A unique way they need to be putting structure into the work, unique way they need to manage identity drivers, and a unique way that they need to adapt behaviors to get greater efficiency of interaction. And what we find, and the way that the assessment's been designed, if you were tracking with me, is to really help you find those couple of items, right? There's several hundred pages of content and then behind that, but the way it's been designed is to roll those items that are most important for you down in each section and help you isolate out what are the 3 or 4 things that I need to go do that can have the biggest impact for me, and give you ideas on what to go do and how to move ahead on battling overload. And this is a really key thing, right? What we find in this is over and over again that the collaborative intensity of work has exploded. And it's a reality that's here to stay. There's no single solution. There's a couple that matter more than most, and usually that's around meetings, email. Do you create pull versus push? Are you managing identity drivers? But really what you're trying to do is isolate out on what are the 3 or 4 things that I need to do, and then play offense, right? Not assume that things are going to get better in 6 to 8 weeks, but actually go out and focus very dogmatically on a small set of things that can buy back about 18 to 24% of your time. The people that do this well tend to outperform over time. They tend to get higher scores on thriving. They tend to, be better performers because they're able to free time and invest in connections that give a greater return. The people that don't really fall into a defensive posture. And you see it over and over again. Their networks become more narrow. They're more reactive to the system. One person in the interviews I did, had this quote that I thought was dead on. Said, "Playing defense sucks. You're always reactive and living in fear. The only way to get out of it is to get clarity on who you are, what you want to do, create the efficiencies you need, and start forging a path and network that enables you to get there." So the first piece of what I wanted to urge people to do today was take the time to take the assessment. I mean, it's a free offer, easy opportunity, and also reflect not just on the rater option in here, but if you want, and if you have the bandwidth to do it, think about rolling these ideas into your teams as well. So as you go through it, you'll see you have the option to take the assessment and put in your ratings, and you'll get something back immediately if you just do that. If you decide that you either want to hear from raters or you want to include your team in it, you can include team members and say, gosh, I'd like to hear how are we doing as a team on some of these items. And the reason we built this in is some of the organizations in the consortium, their leaders are going through this work and they're identifying 3 or 4 things they need to go do differently, and they fervently believe in it and plan to go do things differently, and yet they're thrown back in teams that reinforce the old patterns of behavior, right? And so people came and said, can we look at these not just from an individual standpoint, but how is the team reinforcing certain patterns or not? And again, because this is dummy data, you don't see the typical peaks and valleys. But if you do that, what you'll see in there is the ability to download a team level report as well. And so you can go back to the team and really reflect with that group on how are we operating and what 1 or 2 things do we want to collectively do. And so I won't kind of pull you through all of this, but you get the idea that it can start to give you a sense of what some strengths are with the group, and then where there may be opportunities to have a different kind of effect. So with that, I will say thank you very much And I always appreciate the chance to be able to share these ideas, to talk about them. As you can tell from my own intensity of my voice, I believe in it in a really deep way, not just because statistically we can see the impact of this, but if you go through the hundreds of interviews like I have, and you hit these points where people's guard starts to come down and they start telling you all the demands that they're facing, it's a little bit stressing to see what people are being put through. And basically, if you make it to the manager layer and you're the primary breadwinner, man or woman, doesn't matter, it's a really tough spot to be in these days. And the more we can kind of think about and shift these demands, either individually for ourselves, but just as importantly for our organizations, I think the better we all are. So with that, I will say thank you. And Mike, I think we're right on time for me to turn it back to you for any kind of Q&A you might want to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. This has been fantastic. And again, we want to thank IRC for HR for supporting the distillation of your research in this regard. So one of the questions is, are there certain tools, techniques, or software you would recommend to help analyze and document networks?
So one thing I would strongly recommend, there's a couple things. One is Microsoft has a nice product that they're evolving right now that's called My Analytics, and it in essence enables you to mine email and calendaring data to look and see where time is being spent. Now there's a lot of inferences in that, but it helps you to start to get a sense of where collaborative activities are happening in different ways, and where you might get efficiencies. For example, too many of the same people going to the same meeting, or other kinds of things like that you're able to pick up. So that's one device. We in the consortium that I run, called the Connected Commons, we offer a virtual course once every quarter, and we open it up to the whole public as a good for everybody, that also teaches how to do the network analytics through a couple of other packages. And these are very cheap, efficient ways of going out and learning how to do O&A. It's 6 virtual sessions. Homework assignments are given, but the idea is that we're teaching people how to look at the full network analytics, but then also how to pull individuals out of each network so you can start to see where that might be happening. So those would be two, very efficient ways to get started in this game, at least initially.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Next question. The way that you describe to avoid overload can stall a career if done at the beginning, because work towards outcome is more involved than it needs to be. How do you deal with switching to these behaviors and then withdrawing from them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's not just early stage career people, it's also newcomers. So what we've learned in this is, I'm going to grab the newcomer one as an example. And of course, the early stage career people, what they need to be doing is building a broad network. They do need to be creating this idea of pull. We know that being an energizer, being somebody that creates enthusiasm and gets followership for what you're up to, is statistically the biggest predictor of everything we see. But what's interesting is if we, for example, take the newcomers in an organization, what we've learned is that they don't actually reach out more. They create conditions where they're sought more if they're effective. So they ask a lot of questions, they, create energy, give status, create a mutual win, and they get pulled into networks more rapidly than certainly if people go out and try to tell others how smart they are, right? Here's what I've done before, and all the stuff we're typically told in onboarding that nobody wants to hear. And the question then, though, is there's an inflection point where people have to transition a bit, right? And manage some of these behaviors while simultaneously also building out bridging connections and doing some other things that create their ability to drive value through networks. So what I'm showing here is, if you remember from the very beginning, we said more successful people, they do 3 things through networks differently. They innovate, execute, and thrive. And all I'm showing here is one idea in the thrive component about how you buy back time. And then the question is, what do you do with that time? So I actually think that the new stage career people, if they don't learn to do this early, it creates a derailer at especially the manager level. So I do think they need to be doing these things to become more and more efficient. but then in complement to it, they need to be building a broad network, early stage problem solving. They need to be doing things that create engagement and followership, be an energizer. They do other things and that complement this, that matters as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So this isn't a question, but it's a statement. This is the most informative and usable research I have seen in years from a learning and organizational development perspective. Thank you. I will encourage my team to take your assessment, and I will share this with the broader organization. So at least somebody likes what you're doing. One person out there.
Can you thank my mother for me?
Yes, exactly. Hey, so I had a question, Rob. I actually have two, but the first one is, now that this research has been out for a while, and you've obviously, you talked about going into the boardroom with the CEO, and you're starting to, work with organizations, in a sense on this, not just individuals. Where are you finding the heat is? Where are you finding the energy is from an organizational perspective? Is it, at senior executive levels? Is it at high potentials? Is it where, middle management? Where are you finding the interest? Or if you had to build a business case for this, like if you were in learning and development in a company, where would you start or where would you suggest?
Yeah, so I think the manager level programs are there's two places I would strongly suggest. So when we're targeting these ideas, if I've done a full network analysis, I'm going to ask people's permission to bear with me for a moment as I just kind of scoot around here and remind a little bit of what I covered. If we've done a network analysis, what we can typically see is 3 to 5% of the people account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations, and about half of them are unknown and burning out in different ways. So one of the ways we're using this is to see where are those people in the upper right-hand quadrant that we need to focus effort on, right? And we can then drive results through these very specific diagnostics and coaching tools and things like that, and have really nice effect in shifting collaborative demands. If, let's say, people on this call aren't going to race out and do a network analysis in all their glory, then the second thing I would really be focusing this in on is the manager level transition programs, number one, and then also on the entry programs, number two. And I'll describe each of those, very quickly. What we know over and over and over again is it's that manager level that's just crushed today in a really significant way. You get to the senior level and the derailers are not overload, it's actually bias in your decision making as a product of the network, not implicit bias, but as a product of who has your ear and time actually frees up. And so what we're seeing is, targeting that level and teaching people how to buy back 18 to 24% of their time is a really significant, performance impact for them. The second point is on you can think about it in entry in general, but it's really transitions more broadly. And talent is nowhere near as mobile as too many HR pundits think. I'll say that, in as light a way as I can. We talk about the gig economy or all these other things that are in essence assuming individuals are atoms and we can just pop them in different places, and we're ignoring the networks in different ways. And yet intuitively we know that, senior experienced hires get kicked out in a lot of places because they don't fit the culture. And what I would say is they don't build into the network in different ways. What we know a lot of times in transitions is people choose to come into roles and they force too great a reliance on themselves that derails them in 18 months. If they're not coming in a certain way. So you don't need to come in, as being the person that everybody turns to for the answer. You just want to be the person that can find it quickly, and set expectations around you that way. You don't want to come in and be the expert that everybody goes to, because then you again can't send your people in 18 months and get out of overload that's going to happen. So those would be the two, most significant places we see it at, and they have really significant effects. If you can drive down attrition rates by helping people manage, on entry into an organization, not just that entry period, but through the second spike of attrition, that's a big deal. Or if you get to the manager layer, it's not just them burning out and them slowing down things that kills you. It's that usually the attrition rates around those overloaded leaders are also 200% higher than average for that organization. So you get multiple kind of paybacks by focusing at that specific point.
Thanks, Rob. And maybe a final question here. Rob, are there cultural mores factors that come into play, in this work?
So I'll answer it in the sense of what I think may be being asked, and then if somebody can send me an email if it's different. So I'm going to go down the route of organizational culture and not national for a second. And I without a doubt, think that there are cultures that, for example, embrace ambiguity, right? And like to, move ideas ahead in 20 minutes rather than perfect a plan before moving ahead and driving, huge amounts of overload and feedback and loops that create, excessive demand. There are very, very clearly highly relational cultures where the gridlock has nothing to do with decision rights and how things are allocated. It's that people have gotten used to and conditioned to the notion that you don't do anything until you've involved everybody, or it's going to come back to hurt you later on. And then there are cultures of fear. One of the things that I've had the most fun with over the past 5 or 6 years is many places have actually had the courage to let me map this idea of fear or intimidation. So not, am I getting information from you, but when I interact with you, do I tend to hold back just a little bit? I'm not physically scared of you, but I tend to hold back cutting edge ideas or novel thinking. And that's a death knell when that happens, because you find that people, perfect their plans, they work their plans, back channel, they do a tremendous number of things that create way more work than's necessary, in contrast to people that have been built a higher trust oriented culture. Now, the nice thing about seeing fear from a network standpoint is it's one thing, an organization will come to me and they'll say, we've got this culture of fear. And you're like, oh, dear God, what do we do? Right? It's intractable. It's like cancer at that level. But if you look at it in a network, you actually start to see it's not this culture of fear. You can be looking at a multiple 1,000-person group and you actually start to see, okay, it's a couple of layers or kinds of leaders that aren't leading well, right? They're coming in and they're driving by mandate versus creating followership in the ways that they should. And it's a set of subject matter experts that are too wed, their identity's too wed to being the person, right? And they keep driving people back to them in ways that they shouldn't, and trying to intimidate and show how smart they are. And so you can find different categories of people, some that create the fear and that actually some that are just scared of everybody and propagate inaccurate narratives and coach against it. And you find it's much more tractable when you have this network lens than a strictly cultural one that's very difficult to get your hands around.
Right. Yeah, that all makes sense, Rob. I think that's what the question was asking. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And as we've mentioned, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that Rob will be doing with us over the next month or 2. There's a schedule for that there's been some information shared, on this webinar and in the previous emails that we've sent out to people. People have also asked for the attachments. They are here on the GoToWebinar under handouts. So you can download them from there. If you don't see that or you're having trouble doing that, then please just email us at Executive Networks and we will send them directly to you. Again, we want to thank Jody and her team at IRC for HR for their support of this research. And Rob, thank you very much for your time today. It was fantastic and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Great. Thank you so much.